ho, we ho, we ho. We hey ya ho, we ho, we ho. We hey ya ho, we ho, we ho. We hey ya ho, we ho.
So that was the easy part, or so it seems. Some stock images, Native American music put together. I mean, if it were all that easy. But if this is about critical consciousness, I'm going to have to go deeper.
Hi, this is Tony Martin, and this is the main part of my presentation titled Sacred Justice. This is the part I just alluded to in the video introduction about the opportunity to go kind of deeper into the subject. I have three key intentions for this project. First and foremost was to better understand how climate change specifically impacted the health and well-being of Indigenous communities, both on an individual and a group level. And the first stop along that journey was finding out in general some of the specific ways that changes in the environment are impacting human experience. But more specifically, by focusing on Indigenous communities, I also wanted to increase my own awareness, and perhaps by the end of this presentation, your awareness around Indigenous history, culture, and way of life, both in general and specifically as it relates to the subject matter. And then, yeah, I wanted to end up on highlighting those areas that we as social workers can become more informed about, and the efforts that we can and should take to help address the issue about the negative impacts that climate has on this particular community. As I was doing research, I found a lot of subject matter start to kind of funnel into three key areas for me. That was how climate events have negative impacts on physical health, and there's a ton of research out there that talks about how physical health conditions add a strain to mental health conditions, and they also worsen pre-existing conditions. So things like a really heavy increase in health stressors, more specifically things around respiratory illnesses that are impacted by air pollution and some of the forest fires we've been seeing lately. There's a real increase in infectious diseases, and you might even connect the pandemic to that. These diseases, which are, sometimes waterborne or animal-borne, or even come from an increase in insect infestations. And then probably the area that we're most all familiar with, or at least most exposed to, are all the injuries and sometimes premature deaths that come from catastrophic weather events like hurricanes or tornadoes, floods, things like that. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you, like me, will better understand how climate change is not just an environmental justice issue, but also a social justice issue, and how marginal communities like Indigenous peoples are far more at risk from their adverse effects. I did find that climate change impacting mental health tends to, come into these four kind of key categories for me. There were the physical health issues that I mentioned before, and the impact that those have on our mental health. There's the emotional trauma that comes from experiencing catastrophic events. And there's also the trauma that particularly Indigenous communities experience from historic marginalization and also displacement, things like that. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later on in the presentation. The impact climate change has on the disruption to the underlying socioeconomic determinants of mental health. So things like livelihood, access to shelter, food instability, poverty, things like that. And then this last category, which is definitely an area that's growing in research and understanding, and I'm kind of coining this term enviro-emotional distress. And that's the kind of the experience or the experience of loss or the anticipation of loss of things in our ecosystem, in our environment. And some terms that I'll introduce a little bit later that are really kind of being found a lot in the research right now is solastalgia, environmental grief, and eco-anxiety. More about those in a bit. I wanted to clarify some definitions of things that I'll be talking about. As with a lot of definitions, they can vary depending on the perspective they're coming from. And I really wanted to highlight some definitions that I think are starting to lay the groundwork for this investigation into climate change and the impact on Indigenous well-being. So start off with the World Health Organization. They have a great definition of mental health. And they define it as a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and can work productively and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And I like this definition because it starts to point to some specificity around Indigenous communities, around coping with stressors of life, which are the normal stressors of life that we all face, and the very specific stressors that they encounter as a marginalized community and one more exposed to climate change. And also this notion of community and culture as a way of being directly related to mental health. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through on that. Climate change is something we've been probably hearing around, a phrase that we've been hearing for a few years now or decades. But basically we describe that as predominantly man-made global phenomena that take place over a period of decades. I think the traditional period is 3 decades or 30 years to look at. And these things include things like increase in temperature trends, which we know is kind of global warming, higher sea levels, melting of the ice caps and glaciers, shifts in crop stability, and again, those extreme and more frequent weather events. Environmental justice is something that the EPA describes as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And I like bringing this definition in because it starts to point to the real important place that self-determination has in Indigenous communities, and will again that'll become a little more clear as we go through. But there's a real connection between well-being and Indigenous communities' ability to kind of be self-determinant, have a sense of who they are, and also be important people brought to the table in conversations around the environment. A research article by Consolo and Ellis, this is a little bit wordy, but basically they're defining some of the key areas where climate and weather events and changes in the environment have both direct acute and kind of more ongoing effects on mental health. And those are the strong emotional responses like sadness and despair and hopelessness, anger, fear. There are elevated rates of mood disorders such as depression and anxiety. We see increases in both pre and post-traumatic stress or PTSD, increase in substance use and the mental health conditions that can be co-occurring with those, increased suicide ideation, self-harm behavior, things like that, and attempts and deaths by suicide. And then again, pointing to some of those enviro-emotional areas that I'll talk about. We also see the threats and disruptions to people's sense of place and place attachment, and go on to kind of define that term a little bit later. And also this loss of personal or cultural identity or ways of knowing and being in one's community. Climate justice then has kind of two sides to it. It begins with the idea of understanding these adverse impacts climate has, and how they're not equitably experienced by different people, and particularly underprivileged populations. And climate justice can also refer to the activism that's aimed at addressing some of these inequities. So Indigenous, there's a lot of confusion and different varying opinions about what we call Indigenous peoples. I haven't found that there was a question on whether we should be defining them or not. And so, but to start with, I mean, a general kind of definition that I cobbled together from doing my reading was people who originally lived in a place. This is opposed to people that may have moved there later. And they often have cultural worldviews that place a significance on the relationship between human beings and our environment, nature. Now, according to the United Nations, the best approach is not to actually define Indigenous people as so much as to identify them. And there's maybe it's not so clear the difference between those things, but I think part of it comes from maybe a dominant culture that was probably part of the colonization of some of these communities, being the body that defines or tells people, you know, who and what they are. So a much better approach is to kind of identify different populations of different Indigenous peoples. And when we do that, there are some principles that are generally accepted around identifying those communities, and I've listed some of those here. First and foremost is self-identification as the distinct collective. And that doesn't mean necessarily that that identification is shared with a governing body like a state or a federal government. And definitely we'll talk about the impact that federal recognition of particularly American Indian Indigenous communities has an impact on mental health and well-being. Identifying Indigenous communities also involves a sense of priority in time with respect to the occupation of the territory, the geography they live in. There tends to be a strong link between those areas and the natural resources. There's a voluntary perpetuation of cultural, social, political distinctiveness from the kind of dominant cultures. And generally, when identifying Indigenous communities, we look at the experience of marginalization of those communities. That might be exclusion, dispossession of land, discrimination. And that doesn't mean if it was just, you know, hundreds of years ago, it has no impact on whether or not that those conditions still persist today, which they tend to do. I like this quote from a research study by Oswald, which basically reminds us not only that it was Indigenous people who were here in this land before us, but the way that they treated the land was a lot different than what's happened since then. And that's that they state that how the Native American belief system in particular was one to kind of live in harmony with nature and the environment. And they were stewards of nature. And really, it's been, you know, since 14,000 years ago when European settlers first arrived, and that changed as they started clearing the land. And so that was a real shift in the way the land and environment had been treated up until then by these communities. Very quickly, some demographics. According to Amnesty International, there are roughly 370 million Indigenous people living across the world. They live in different types of communities, up to 5,000 of them, often speaking different languages, and they can be found in more than 90 countries. So you can have a quick look at the map and see that, you know, Indigenous peoples exist all over the planet, which also kind of points to the idea that of intersectionality, and that not all Indigenous people have the same experience, both either historically or in the present. As we focus in on the United States, I found out that the federal government currently recognizes 574 Indigenous tribal nations. There's another 200 Indigenous communities that actually lack federal recognition, so they're not recognized by the US government. 15 states don't have any federally recognized tribes, and you can kind of see that in how the colorations on this map are. Roughly, if you combine Native American, Alaskan Native, and Hawaiian Native peoples, which aren't always kind of put into the same bucket, but I wanted to kind of highlight those different groups. It's roughly about 12 million of the US population, or probably something close to 2% of the population. And then you can see states with some of the highest density of indigenous populations, Alaska by far. I think a total of 40% of all indigenous people who live in the United States currently live in Alaska. And you can see some of those other states, and you'll notice that they're all to the west. You know, if you know your American history, about the Trail of Tears, about the disposition of many kind of indigenous peoples that were based along the Atlantic coast in the east, and how they were forced to kind of move out west. And you see that kind of in the disproportionate amount of communities that are located out that way today. And then specifically in North Carolina, you know, the federal government only recognizes one indigenous tribe here in this state. North Carolina has its own recognition process, and they've recognized another 7 tribal nations, and there's some other smaller organizations that have state recognition. But again, this is really important, particularly the lack of federal recognition, because that means there's a lack of support around healthcare, support around other benefits that might be provided at a federal level that some people in these communities just don't have access to, because simply for the fact that the government doesn't recognize them. And that has a very direct and an immediate impact on well-being of those populations. And yeah, this kind of slide sums that up. Left without political power or critical support needed to address adverse climate events. These communities that don't have federal recognition are some of the most vulnerable communities on the planet, not just in this country, but on the planet. Here's some data points that I came across that speak to some of the pre-existing situations that Indigenous people face, primarily through systemic discrimination and marginalization. And just a general statement how the colonization of these lands has greatly impacted the kind of traditional ways of healing and being for a lot of Indigenous communities. And this has massive health disparities between the way that if we compare Indigenous people's health and to the greater population. I found this staggering that only 1% of American Indian Alaskan Native homes are actually owner occupied. So we talk about generational wealth and social justice issues, and we see that Indigenous communities lack generational wealth in general, but also as it pertains to ownership of property. And you compare that 1% to 64% of the total US population, and you see how staggering that statistic is. In general, Indigenous people report psychological stress 2.5 times more than the general population. The death rate from suicide for adolescents in Indigenous populations is double that of non-Hispanic whites. And something also interesting, just that the average or the median age of people who live on reservations is much younger. And then we find that 29% of the American Indian Alaska Native population is actually under the age of 18. So there's also some specific health inequities around working with children and younger people that are disproportionate to the rest of the population. And I think this also points to this other data point, which is across the world, depending on which country we're looking at, the life expectancy of Indigenous peoples is anywhere between 5 and 8 years less than the general populations they live in. And then, you know, a figure that you may be aware of, but 1 in 4 Indigenous people currently lives in poverty. And there's a lot of direct correlations between poverty and general health, and particularly mental health. Okay, getting a little more specific around climate and its impact on the well-being. First, this slide is a general kind of slide of, you know, some more obvious climate events that you may be aware of: hurricanes and floods and fires, some of the things mentioned before. But some things maybe are a little less familiar that are direct impacts of climate change. The food instability from changes in crops and soil. I mentioned before the insect and pathogen outbreaks that occur, population displacement and migration, people moving from homelands to being displaced to other areas. Tree diseases, air pollution, And this is, again, on the right side is a general list of some of the impacts that direct and indirect these climate events can have on well-being in general, and definitely disproportionate to the Indigenous community. I mentioned before elevated mood disorders, things around anxiety and depression. PTSD is prevalent in these communities. There's a decreased sense of self and identity. Self-harm behaviors and suicide are at higher levels, both in these communities and also as a direct impact of the relationship they have with the land and the impacts of climate change. And again, you'll see at the bottom these three key terms that I'm going to get into a little bit more later that I found kind of interesting and want to spend some time on: solastalgia, eco-anxiety, environmental grief, and also changing place attachment. Okay, another slightly long quote, but I think an important one. This is from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. It states that Indigenous peoples are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change due to their dependence upon and close relationship with the environment and resources. Both, I get this as a sense, both of their geographical location, they tend to be in more drought prone areas or on coastal areas that we find that it might be more prone to sea rises, things like that, but also as it relates to the relationship with the land. They go on to say that while Indigenous people contribute the least amount of greenhouse emissions and they have the smallest ecological footprint generally on the planet, they are disproportionately affected by climate events. And these events can exacerbate the difficulties they already face, including continuing political and economic marginalization, the loss of their land and resources, very direct human rights violations, and discrimination and unemployment, which can be very pervasive in this community. So I just alluded to some of these in that last slide, but why in particular Indigenous communities are predisposed perhaps to be more greatly impacted, or what situations or circumstances do they exist in that predisposes them, what systems exist. I mentioned the geographic exposure, that they tend to not only be located geographically where there might be more impact to climate change, but their inability to own their own homes, probably the quality of the domiciles that they live in is less than and less able to withstand catastrophic weather events. There are some existing barriers to mental health care. A lot of Indigenous communities, not all, they exist in kind of isolated locations because of the history of this country and displacement. And there's a real mistrust of government in a lot of Indigenous communities. And that, I think something like 40% of Indigenous communities are currently on Medicaid of one form or another. And yet they are very distrustful of the providers and the government agencies that are set up to in some cases, help them. A lot of Indigenous people will see healthcare providers that have zero experience in working for that community. And although there are many Indigenous people that are insured through either private insurance or Medicaid, they are 3 times more likely to live without health insurance at 15% of their population. There's a real lack of cultural competence, both in healthcare providers and even agencies that are set up to work and support Indigenous communities. Language barriers exist, which can be a contributing factor to being able to access and realize benefits from mental health. There's a real emotional vulnerability that displaced Indigenous folks experience through changing place attachments. They're already emotionally vulnerable by the experience that they've been through. There's a high poverty rate, which I've mentioned. I've seen one statistic that's at 27% for Indigenous communities and about 10.5, 11% for the country as a whole. Generational and historical trauma, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is a real issue in Indigenous communities and one that probably lacks a lot of focus or understanding. There are forced government policies that impact self-determination, which historically and culturally is a very important facet of Indigenous communities, this capacity to self-govern and self-determine and to be able to fully realize their way of being in the world. There are limited and restricted access to resources and legal protections, primarily, again, those communities which I mentioned that aren't recognized by the federal government. They're very vulnerable and have much less access to things, protections and to resources. And then again, some things that we've already talked about, the concurrent health concerns and pre-existing mental conditions that Indigenous populations have historically experienced and continue to experience. Now, I want to take some time to really talk about specific trauma experiences that are related to the Indigenous experience. First and foremost is historical trauma. These are the psychological effects that colonialism, some of that forced relocation, assimilation into our cultures, displacement and genocide, and some other traumas that are inflicted and have been inflicted on Indigenous populations. There's a long history in this country of taking Indigenous children out of the homes. It was a policy begun in the 1950s, and replacing those Native children in either group homes or homes that were from the dominant culture. There's the intergenerational trauma. This is the kind of cumulative trauma and the psychological wounding that is carried across generations. Can be described as kind of unconscious grief that's passed down. And that's from all the historical trauma, either through stories or just the mental health conditions that are exacerbated for generations before, the loss of spiritual practices and language and culture that people experience. Of course, there's racism and racial bias and discrimination that creates trauma, the experience of trauma for Indigenous populations. And we know that institutional racism worsens the underlying determinants of health and mental health in general. The witnessing or being directly involved in violent struggles is another source of trauma for this community. Changing place attachment. There's another slide that I'm going to talk about, which gets into this a little bit more, but it's this kind of emotional trauma that's experienced by relocating from your natural environment that you have a particularly strong bond with, sometimes to urban centers, which is, creates its own potential for trauma to kind of live in an inner city after living in acres and acres of wide open land. Part of that transition, and just in general, is a difficulty that Indigenous people can experience in trying to integrate their traditional beliefs and their spiritual beliefs and that culture with kind of a modern pace and a modern lifestyle. There's direct trauma experience from these severe weather events that we talked about, which we know that Indigenous people are disproportionately have disproportionate impacts to. Again, there's feelings, trauma around the lack of self-determination or autonomy or control. If you can imagine just kind of basically being told one day to pick up your things and leave and start a whole new life in a whole new environment, perhaps not with the community that you grew up in, and what that might feel like as an experience. And again, this term again, solastalgia, which is an experience of environmental loss and grief. Here's some of those in a little bit more detail. Again, this is an area where there's a growing interest in research, and I found it quite interesting. And I don't know if people are using it, but I came up with this term, enviro-emotional stressors. So changing place attachment. We know that people, how people construct themselves, their identity, how they exist in kind of their physical environment, the process of doing that creates an emotional attachment. And so when that emotional attachment is severed because either the identity of that person in the environment or the environment has changed, it has some real direct stressors on mental health. In particular, place plays a really important role in providing Indigenous peoples with a sense of cultural identity, with a sense of belonging and a sense of way of being, which sometimes goes back thousands of years. Disrupted cultural continuity. There's strong cultural connections and continuities we know can be buffers to adverse health conditions. So a sense of belonging, a sense of community is something that can be something that's helpful when we're faced with difficult situations. And so when Indigenous communities, which probably have some of the strongest cultural connections and continuity, when those are disrupted, it really takes away that kind of that buffer, that benefit, to be able to better handle mental health related conditions. And yeah, this loss of land, which tends to be associated with very powerful memories and cultural touchstones, when that's kind of taken away from people, it really challenges and impacts how they are, their well-being and how they can be in the world. This idea of self-determination is incredibly important to these communities. A feeling of self-sufficiency, of being, who we are, is really foundational to Indigenous mental health. And so when that is challenged or they're discriminated against based on that, it has a real impact. This dislocation that communities feel and the kind of an inherent lack of any kind of political and socioeconomic power really contributes to adverse mental health conditions as well. Solastalgia, now describe that as the distress and threat to individual and collective identity experienced from the absence of solace provided by nature, often in the aftermath of environmental disruption. And we're shortly, or very kind of more to the point, I think of solastalgia as a violation of an endemic sense of place. So again, we just kind of did a little experiment and you closed your eyes for a moment or kept them open and just thought of kind of, I don't know, your happy place, or maybe a place where you go to be at one with a higher power, maybe a church or a mosque or a temple, or it could just be the beach and being out in nature and having a real felt sense of what that feels like as you place yourself there. And then imagine all of that being taken away. Imagine that the majority of people around you are dismantling that piece by piece. And not only is it happening to you, but you're witnessing it. And so solastalgia really kind of points to that distress, that environmental loss that we experience when we have a loss of space, a loss of culture, a loss of our place in the world. This also points to environmental grief and eco-anxiety, which I think can be experienced in the larger population, but definitely as it relates to Indigenous communities. This is an emotional response to some of the non-economic loss and harm from climate change. So all the media reports that we get on species extinction, the loss of farmland and space for animals, the loss of culture and way of life, and again, the loss of identity that we all can have to nature and the physical environment, that there's a real expressed sense of grief around all of that. And sometimes it's quite pervasive, sometimes it's quite obvious, and sometimes it's just below the surface there. And that can be combined with, or we can also experience eco-anxiety, which I describe as the psychological burdens of climate crisis. And this appears kind of in the form of either chronic stress or fear about, I don't know, the worst possible scenario happening, environmental destruction. The mind tends to catastrophize events. And when we see some of the very real impacts of climate change, it's quite natural for our minds, and particularly people who are much closer to the land and the nature, to experience real anxiety and fear associated with the environment's destruction. So what can we do about it? So these are some of the things that I'd like to share with you. I thought if there was ever an opportunity where we found ourselves about to work with a client or with a population or a community or even an agency that represents Indigenous populations, these are some questions we should do as a check-in for ourselves. Ask ourselves, have we ever treated an Indigenous person or worked with an Indigenous population before? I mean, it seems something simple, but just to know that, wow, this is my first experience with this. I only know what I don't know, and I don't know also what I don't know. So just checking in, like, oh no, I don't think I've done this before, and as a real important first self check-in. Along those lines, if you've had experienced or treated Indigenous populations before, do you have any real exposure, access to training that might relate to the specific and unique spirituality or traditional practices of this population? Some people might consider this type of spirituality or these practices in the world of maybe a little woo-woo, but it is very real part of these cultures. And just to have a better understanding and to seek out some training and understanding around these practices, which go back thousands and thousands of years, and in many situations predate all the more, dominant culture, spirituality, and religious traditions that are out there. Are you aware that certain indigenous cultures may not either seek out or be receptive to either mental health treatment or social workers in general? Do you understand that there might be some cultural barriers to that? Do you have training in trauma-informed care? As we just discussed a little bit, there's a lot of trauma related to this particular population, and not just the kinds that you might have already received training in. Do you have the capacity to respect and demonstrate empathy towards these practices and the worldviews of this population? Can you really be open to understanding and listening to diverse perspectives and beliefs around different things? Are you educated enough in how these populations have been historically marginalized, particularly in this country? It behooves us all to kind of dig in and be in the uncomfortable a little bit and find out a little bit more about some of those historical and generational traumas that this community has had to engage with. Something simple as, do you believe in the sovereignty of Indigenous people? Do you believe that they should have self-determination? Do you believe Indigenous nations and communities should be independent, be federally recognized? And if so, are you willing to assert that on behalf of these peoples? And then finally, this one kind of caught me off guard a little bit. I don't know that it should have, but are you aware of how much social work, the history of social work, has actually contributed to the oppression and marginalization of these communities? And it kind of alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, and whether we should identify or define communities, that, there's this historical fallacy that social work began with Jane Addams and in a white dominant culture, European culture, when in fact, social work and support for the community has been going on in Indigenous communities for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's important to also recognize that as the dominant culture, and often kind of being a part of this outreach and support for communities, that can also be seen as a way of disempowering people. So it's really important to understand the power of social work, but also historically how that has been translated into our own education and how we go about our jobs. Social workers have an ethical obligation to advocate for these Indigenous rights and environmental justice as a whole. We can do this by working directly with communities to address the social determinants of health that are related to climate change and exacerbate in these communities. Again, livelihood, food security, housing, infrastructure, transport. We need to understand and demonstrate a culture of humility around Indigenous culture, something we've been learning a lot about. Again, recognize the importance of place and the connection to nature in these communities and how that impacts mental health well-being. To really understand and identify the sociopolitical barriers that are unique to this community around that supports their protection and sustainability. And probably, I think most importantly, is to understand that in general, because of the history, but also the importance of self-determination, that whatever interventions and whatever support we are prepared to engage with these communities on, they must be developed with the communities. It shouldn't be specifically just for Indigenous peoples. Need to be involved, as with all marginalized communities, in the development of intervention support that will greatly impact. They're the experts after all. We need to see continuing education opportunities that are related to specifically disaster relief as it relates to the general population, but also how that can be implemented in Indigenous communities who are experiencing trauma from that. Also recognize the intersectionality of Indigenous communities. This is not a one-size-fits-all category. There are many diverse nations, there are unique cultures, and there are very different historical experiences. So to understand that going in, that just because someone self-identifies Indigenous, It doesn't mean that they have the same cultural experience or the same historical experience as another Indigenous person. And just to really understand that by recognizing these things and Indigenous people's rights in general, this can be one of the most effective ways in fight against the mental health impact that climate change causes. Just becoming fully aware, being engaged, collaborating with communities, understanding that supporting these rights has direct implications, impact on how climate change continues to evolve and affect these communities. These are some of the references, but that is the bulk of my presentation. I hope, again, you were able to see some of the direct impacts both on physical health and mental health that these communities experience. I hope at least there's an introduction to a basic understanding of the history and cultures around these people, or maybe instilled a curiosity for you to kind of learn more. And also some of the things that we can begin to think about, both in direct practice and ways that we can become active and demonstrate understanding around how climate and historical marginalization has impacted these communities. Thank you, and have a great day. So I hope that presentation was informative and there was something to take away for you. I didn't want to just end on my voice and talking about the negative impacts. Here's a different voice, a voice from an Indigenous community with perhaps a silver lining.
Hi, I'm Charmaine Barrows. I come from Denver, Colorado. I came out here to Standing Rock, North Dakota, to support the struggle behind the pipelines, because we know how important our water is, and we've been fighting for our water most of our lives and our land. Our land was taken away from us, and it's being done over again and again. And so we come together here. We have the first time in 180 years that all tribes are coming together. This is a historical day, and we're just really happy to be here and see the solidarity people have in the camp. And we know that if we work collectively together, that we can make changes in the world, because we know a better world is possible.